Okay, cool. Then, for everyone who just joined, please rename yourself to your name and then which team you're part of. And right now, we're about to start going into the first section of the global outreach meeting. So we thought that it would be pretty nice to talk about just generally what types of builds are strategic and also like generally how we should be able to build because we're like beginning to start like going into the season. So to begin with this global outreach meeting, we thought it would be really productive to start talking about the intake. So we can start off with the quality control members. Rick and Sophia, what do you guys think about the intake and how do you think we should approach this on a build level so we can really optimize for efficiency and everything?
Yeah, in terms of intake, there's two main types of intake. There's active intake, passive intake, such as Claw. I think for this season, active intake is probably the best choice because it's pretty flexible in terms of game element orientation when picking them up, and also it's pretty decently fast. One issue with active intake is how you can get the transfer working. And so far, we've brainstormed with having two compliant wheels on either side of the intake, rotating in opposite directions um, to get this game element to be vertical relative to the robot. In terms of claw, it's probably going to be a lot easier when you're picking up irregular game elements like specimens, especially because of the clip. But the thing with claw is that you have to have it in a specific orientation when picking it up. So that means that the error margin is going to be a lot lower.
Yeah, that's a great introduction, Nick. Sophia, do you have anything to add to the claw?
Yeah, definitely. I think the two things to consider would be whether you want more of a passive intake or active intake, and both of them definitely have their pros and cons. So I'd like to ask, does everyone else like have any ideas for intakes that they've considered already or want to discuss?
Okay, so first of all, you guys can just feel free to unmute whenever and like just contribute to the conversation. This is very casual. No need to worry. I think what we want to specify further is what do we think about like active versus passive intake? Do we agree that maybe active intake would be a little bit better for the season's game, especially, or do we think passive intake such as a claw would be better? Or what have your teams considered and what have you guys prototyped so far?
I think that so far during this season, we've seen a lot of teams use a combination of the two, especially at a higher level, because intaking the samples with an active intake is quite more simple than intaking specimens with an active intake. And it goes vice versa. Using a claw to intake specimens is helpful because it locks it to the 90-degree angles or whatever. But intaking specimens is a bit slower using a claw. So I expect to see a lot of rookie teams picking one or the other, but I expect to see top teams using a combination of the two.
Yeah, I agree with that. Currently, we're also planning on using claws to score the specimens while using an active intake to score everything else because we need that precision and the accuracy.
Yeah, does anyone want to add on to like what their team is currently prototyped for the intake? Addie, what have you guys like thought of so far as to like what intake you guys are planning on using?
So currently we mostly worked on like our active intake. So currently we've tried something with surgical tubing and we've thought that might work. So now we have like a 3D model with where we'll attach a bearing and a servo and then we'll have a spot for our sample to get picked up in. And then that's where we can probably use like a claw or another type of intake or device to pick it up and then use that to score the sample or hand it over to a human player for like to make the specimen.
Yeah, I love that idea. I think definitely the intake is going to be one of the most challenging parts of the game just generally because it's pretty hard to decide between like whether an active intake is better or a passive intake is better, but I like that idea. Yeah, I agree with Coach Strun. How would you prevent intaking the wrong color in like autonomous period, for example?
If you'd like, I can share a video that we've prototyped so far this season that illustrates that concept.
Oh, really? That would be great. Do you have sharing permissions right now?
I believe I do. Let me try.
Okay, we'd love to see that video. I think it'd be really
Yes,
helpful.
I do. All right. Can you guys see the screen?
Yep.
All right. So this is just a mock-up that we did of an intake. We just have some tubing on a servo, and it's actually the side of our chassis. So we have a color sensor taped to it, and we're using the Rev Color Sensor V3, so it can detect both proximity and color. So what we do in this example is we detect when a sample has entered the intake within an inch or so. Once it has, we stop, we detect the color, and if it's not blue in this instance, we will spit it out. So let me show you that.
Like what? How do you think what unit Dr. will give? What unit? Yeah.
Yes, so that's definitely one way to verify you have the right color and that you have a sample during autonomous.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really smart way in order to like spit out the wrong color during autonomous period. I feel like especially during this game's challenge because colors are just like so essential to the game that using like these color sensors such as Limelight will be really essential. Rick, what do you think?
Yeah, obviously we're going to need a color sensor. Using camera detection for verifying the identity of game elements is probably not the most efficient. In terms of that intake, I believe you just showed us. How do you expect to pick up game elements that are horizontally oriented with respect to the noodles?
That intake was just really just a mock-up to allow us to bring the samples close to the color sensor. In our final iteration, we intend to have some sort of wedge. So as samples enter, they are oriented to, in this case, a vertical orientation, but we're definitely considering using a horizontal one as well. The reason we like vertical so far is that it's more easy to prevent multiple samples from being intaken. Whereas with a horizontal one, two samples could potentially get stuck like this.
Yeah. About using that wedge, I believe our team also experimented with using some kind of like passive feature to help orient the samples vertically. One issue we found out is that, for example, if you have a slightly rough surface or something, there's going to be friction against the sides, and sometimes the samples can get stuck in a region where the noodles or the wheels can't really reach the sample and it can't turn it around. So have you thought about like maybe potentially active ways of orienting the samples?
One thing that we haven't like prototyped out yet, but we might want to use in our final iteration is not only having a top-down active intake, but we might also want to have small wheels on the side of the intake that can help to get samples off the sides like you were illustrating to get into the main intake.
Yeah. So just having those on both the noodles on the top and also those wheels on the side. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
like
think that's a decent idea.
yeah, like I think one like inspiration that we could take for that kind of thing is you know the Robo Kings Aurum in Power Play. They had like a gripper like everybody else to intake the cones, but they also had side rollers, which helped the orientation with their gripper. So I think we might take inspiration from that and have side rollers in our like intake system.
Yep, sounds good.
Yeah, I think taking inspiration from like other plays or other models would be like generally like it's a really good way to develop these prototypes, for example, and specifically about the power play intake with the rollers, I think it definitely could be a strategy for the build that could be really effective. Let's see. In terms of intake, I actually have a question for other people. If like a team were, for example, to use a passive intake such as a claw, how would we be able to minimize the margin for error in the like prototype for the claw? Because especially with like passive intakes, for example, it'd be really hard to make sure that the claw can pick up the block every single time, you know? So does anyone have any like thoughts generally on like how to minimize that margin of error for passive intakes?
Totally. I know that we've seen in the robot in 3 days, and our team has been prototyping as well. We've seen a lot of claws that implement a pyramid design to conform to the inside shape of these samples. Um, so I could definitely see teams trying to minimize the margin of error by designing a claw with a pyramid on the end. So from whatever orientation they grab the samples, it's locked in a specific way so they have to worry less about having more degrees of freedom to rotate it and make sure it's in the right orientation.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a definitely a really smart strategy that like our team definitely could be adopting and trying if we were to develop more like a passive intake for our robots intake. Other than that, I was actually wondering if anyone else in the conversation or the Zoom meeting had any questions or thoughts when it regarding like intakes in general. So, does anyone else want to jump into the conversation right now and just share their thoughts on what they think might be a good intake or what like a good claw design might be?
Okay, it looks like everyone doesn't have that many questions. I'm just gonna take this opportunity and share one of the prototypes our team made for active intake and also one that I made for claw intake. Let me try sharing my screen. Yeah. Okay, can everyone see my screen well?
Yep.
Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see my screen and not just one person. But this is what I was talking about with a compliant wheel intake. So over here we have two compliant wheels on the top that force the sample into the robot. And then afterwards, we have two wheels, and they're both rotating either clockwise or counterclockwise instead of rotating in opposite directions like normal intakes might have. And this has the effect of rotating the sample so that it's in that vertical orientation and being able to be fed into this back chamber here. But one issue we notice with this design is that yeah, even with this kind of active orientation and not just a wedge, the sample kept getting stuck when it was, I think, in about this position here, where this compliant wheel kept trying to turn, but um, this other corner, the top left corner of this sample here, got rammed against the wall, and the sample just gets stuck there. Of course, we could also try other things on the top over here, such as noodles or Goboda boot wheels, and those are certainly things that we could try. Does anyone have any questions regarding this or any thoughts for how we could maybe try and improve this design? Okay, it appears not.
I would
Yeah.
just be concerned about like weight.
Yeah,
That's
the
like the
weight,
only
weight
like
is definitely an
disadvantage.
issue. This is more of, I think it was like a proof of concept or just a
Okay.
first prototype. This is decently heavy, especially if you're using a deployable intake mechanism. You're going to mount this on the slide. This is certainly going to be infeasible. Another consideration is that you have to angle this intake downwards. Otherwise, the compliant wheels won't be able to hit the specimen if it's flat against the ground over here. So if I reorient this, if the specimen is just flat against the ground, then these compliant wheels won't even be able to touch the sample until much later. So that's definitely another consideration. And also, we're going to either have to mount a servo or a motor somewhere, and that placement is definitely another issue to consider. So this was just one of our early prototypes. I'm going to show you guys another one, which is a claw intake. Give me a second. It appears that I cannot find it right now. Yeah, I lost the document. How unfortunate. Okay, yeah, we can move on.
Yeah, okay. That's all right, Rick. And thank you so much for sharing the CAD design with us. I think it was really helpful. Other than that, are there any like final thoughts or questions on for specifically intake design before we move on?
I have one question or comment for everyone, and I would like to hear everyone's thoughts on this. I know that this season, even more than center stage, there's definitely going to be variations of designs that use motors for intakes or servos for intakes. What do you think we will be seeing most of this season?
Personally, I think for this season, we'll definitely see a combination of both, but I'd still think that motor intakes are probably going to be a lot more prevalent, especially because you sometimes need that extra power when like preventing jams and stuff. And servos, historically they've been known to get stuck sometimes or break, and especially because there is a limit for the total extension. Um, in past seasons, one of the drawbacks to using a motor is that it's heavy and you have to move it around. But this season, you're not going to have that much extension anyways, and having a motor could certainly be a lot more helpful.
Thank you for clarifying that. I can also see the benefits of a motor in terms of having more data available from it, like the voltage draw and velocity, so you can kind of infer whether you have a sample from that.
Yeah, that is definitely another benefit as well.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh yeah, Ben, what's up?
I was wondering like how people are thinking about like the clip rule. Like how like if teams are thinking of like doing some like magazine style, like fold like 10 of them, insert them into like correctly oriented sample and then attaching them. Because it seems like the worst thing in the game would be to move multiple times from the submersible to the like the alliance, like your human player, and then back. So like having a clip mechanism is like game changing kind of,
Yeah,
especially when like the assumption is that like you're able to like put as many of like the yellow samples up into the high basket as possible. Um so that your opponents don't get those points.
Yeah, I definitely think that that is a pretty big consideration to make, especially because it saves you the time of driving to the human player and back, and also that's going to reduce conflicts with your alliance partner as you're moving back and forth. In terms of whether this is going to change the season's game a lot, I say early season it's probably not going to be that important, and it's going to be pretty difficult to implement because even when you're putting on the clips with your hands, it's kind of difficult to do. And if you're creating a mechanism, it's prone to error. For example, if you don't clip it on in the right orientation, if the sample is a bit off, the clip's not going to go on. You're going to have subsystems with a decent amount of a margin of error and precision. Late season, I definitely think that a lot of teams will implement this. Although I think that it's going to cause a lot of trade-offs. You're going to have to maybe consider in terms of space, if you have that like, I don't know, 10, 20 clip magazine inside your robot, in terms of spatial concerns, it's going to have some issues. But yeah, this is definitely something to try, I think. Um, it's probably going to be one of those features that win the Innovate Award or one of those other design related ones. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Ben, did that clarify your question slash consideration? Okay, cool. That's great. I think now is a great time to move on to other parts of the build, so specifically the transfer design and the outtake. So generally, what are we thinking about what would be a good outtake design? Or like if we were to transfer the intake to the outtake, what would be a good design for that? Or should we use the same intake and intake as the outtake as well? So what are we feeling for that, or what are we have teams prototyping right now?
I
I
can
think
definitely see
I think I saw in uh the intake design that you guys shared as well as what we're thinking is that at the back of the intake, like the place where the samples are stored, there's like a little gap for where Claw can pick up the sample and bring it towards the deposit, like a slide, and then that can be like dropped somewhere. And I think that's also what we're going for, like a place in the intake where a clock can come and take a sample.
Yeah, I think that concept for transfer is probably going to be the simplest and most feasible this season, that having a small space. One consideration to make is once again like weight. If you're going to have that small space in the back, and if you're going to have extendo intake, right, you're going to have to carry that small bit of the intake along and back. Um, I believe there's also been some other ideas regarding transfer, without this kind of small space in the back, that I can't think of off the top of my head right now, but I was wondering whether anyone else had any other suggestions for transfer mechanisms.
I mean, of course, there are always transfer list designs, which I think is what a lot of rookie teams will attempt to accomplish this season. And I think a lot of rookie and even intermediate teams will accomplish something like this and be able to execute it quite well. Especially this season, if you're going to be transferring specimens, that's quite a difficult task. So I can see a combination of just a transfer for the samples and then using a single mechanism for the specimen or mounting it on a mechanism like an outtake.
Yeah, I think just reducing that transfer and just having the same subsystem intake outtake is definitely an idea, although it might not be as competitive as separate subsystems. Yeah. Um, I believe another different kind of transfer is to just have the intake move it into a bucket that is attached to the outtake, which you could then bring up and score inside the, I believe they're called baskets, like the plastic boxes. I forgot what those are called. But in terms of scoring specimens, that might not be as feasible or reliable. I think I also found the other intake design, the one that I made. So I'm just going to share it right now.
Yeah, let's check it out.
Okay. So this was just another idea for a type of intake. It's kind of like a claw, but the main issue with claws is you have to have the sample in a specific orientation. So what this type of intake does is you can intake a sample regardless of whether it's here or if it's rotated. Let me find the rotation button. Doesn't seem like I can find it right now. Yeah, or if it's rotated at an angle over here, the claw will always write the sample so that it's in the correct orientation and be picked up. One issue with this is that transfer is going to be slightly more difficult because after you finish intaking, it's either going to be horizontal or vertical, one or the other, and you have to create a transfer system that accounts for both of these. One nice thing about this is that it only uses one servo and it can pull these arms inwards and outwards all at once. Does anyone have any questions regarding this design or any comments?
Yeah, I had a comment. That seems like a really interesting design. It seems like it would do a much better job than a typical, like traditional gripper. If you can figure out something for the orientation, maybe you have some kind of like wall kind of structure. That might help in terms of orientation. But overall, it looks pretty good.
Yeah. One primary issue with this intake design is the samples are going to be scattered randomly in the space where you pick up samples. And if there's like two samples nearby, this might struggle with that and get stuck. And also, one other part of this intake is that there's enough space, for example, over here on the side, where you can mount color sensors and detect the color of the samples. But it's kind of hard to just move on to another sample if you find out that your sample is the wrong color. And speaking of that, this season, there's only like I believe a minor penalty for picking up your opposing alliance's samples. And if you can pick it up and you can score it fast enough, you'll still have a net point gain. So I was wondering whether anyone else had any considerations regarding spitting out samples versus just scoring them as fast as possible and still getting those points, even though you get that small minor penalty. Oh, apparently they have changed the rule to a major, so never mind then. Yeah.
Yeah, on that note, how, like, what other designs or ideas do we have for, like, from intaking the sample all the way to scoring it, scoring specimen specifically onto the bar? I forgot what it's called, but, like, how are we thinking, like what types of outtake designs should we use that are probably most suitable for scoring specimens?
I could definitely see for a lower level arms or for a higher level linear slides on a pivot being used this year, because it really allows you to both intake and outtake out of the front and back of the robot, and it allows you to do so even if you have another mechanism like an intake. So you could pivot forward and score the specimen on the high rung, and then immediately after letting go, you would have a separate intake mechanism that immediately can grab another sample.
I think that's a really smart design idea that could definitely be implemented, and it would also really help with efficiency because that way you could obviously like be doing two things at once, and it would really optimize the robot. Does anyone have any other like additional information they may want to like contribute or like questions in general about like transfer and outtake design?
I just wanted to get like everybody's thoughts specifically for like an outtake design, and this might work best for a claw. But I mean, something we've been talking about a lot is increasing the amount of degrees of freedom that we can have to an outtake. So in this case, obviously a claw. So I was wondering what other teams were thinking about having like at least like 3 degrees of freedom or maybe more when it comes to having that type of outtake design.
Yeah, I think the amount of degrees of freedom you have in terms of intake and outtake is an important consideration. One main thing to know is that for every additional degree of freedom you add, you're going to have at least like one more servo, and there's going to be like issues with the wirings and spacing and all that. I think like in we do not actually need that many degrees of freedom. Um, Personally, I think 2 degrees or what 2 degrees of freedom aside from the claw itself is probably sufficient, especially because sometimes your slides aren't going to be perfectly aligned with the mission task, which means that you're going to have that 1 degree of freedom and rotate it so that it's aligned. But aside from that, I don't think you need that many more degrees of freedom.
One
I
question I
also
have
think.
for
Oh, no, okay, I'll just go. Like I also think that like some sort of like lane assisted, like some more software related ways to like make it so that like you don't have to have as many degrees of freedom as you're like talking about. Like if you're always on the same like heading, like it won't matter as much. You can just automate your like outtake toward on like the chamber or whatever the rail it's called. Yeah.
Jason, did you want to add on to what Ben said?
Sure. I was in terms of I was going to add on to the degrees of freedom thing. I was wondering everyone's thoughts on degrees of freedom on the intake, specifically having horizontal movement, because I think a lot of top teams are going to have such a design where you can be scoring a specimen and immediately be able to intake after that. But one limitation would be if you had to move the robot left, right, forwards, or backwards to collect a sample. So do you think we'll see type of extension to eat up that 20-inch horizontal limit?
Yeah, I think that that is definitely something to consider if you can just move the intake side to side while your scoring and the outtake positions being held constant. That would definitely expedite the process of intaking, scoring, and quickly intaking another. I think you mentioned this, but I think the main issue with that is that 20-inch limit. If your robot is about 18 inches wide, you're not going to have that much room for movement on the sides. And also, it kind of depends on what kind of mechanisms are you using for that side-to-side movement. If you're using a tiny slide mounted on your intake, once again, that's going to cause issues, especially if you're going to have the intake go over the, I think it's like a 2-inch metal beam or something at the bottom, and getting that across is going to be cause some design complications.
Yeah, totally. It'll definitely be something that is hard to execute, but I feel like some top teams might have it in order to shave a few milliseconds off of their cycle time.
I
Yeah,
think
I think another like similar way that this kind of strategic point can be achieved is like a yaw degree of freedom on the intake. That would kind of achieve a similar thing and take up less space.
Yeah, I think someone mentioned a mini turret intake, and I think that's definitely something we can consider. Yeah.
Also, maybe instead of a mini turret, you might have like a differential like intake slide where like like your claw can kind of move like this way while also being extended.
Yeah.
That's like something.
That's definitely something to think about as well.
I think like yeah, all of these like ideas are really smart designs that could definitely be implemented and we could definitely see them like in this season moving forward. I also think now is a really great time to transition into Hang specifically because there's so little other tasks to do, especially like during this season of Into the Deep. The Hang is going to be a really important design or element of the game that we're going to have to talk a lot about. So generally, how are we thinking about how to hang to the second bar or how to minimize weight on the robot in general so the robot's going to be able to hang?
I think one thing that's interesting to consider, um, especially when we're trying to get to that third level of hanging, if we're able to have something that's able to either do the intake or do the outtake, that's also minimize the total amount of weight you have on your robot.
Yeah, I definitely think that integrating a hang mechanism into one of your current subsystems will definitely help reduce that weight and also complications. In terms of hang right now, I think one of the main obstacles is that when you're hanging, after you hang on low bar, your robot's center of gravity will have to shift to be directly underneath the low bar because of how physics works. And then after you're directly underneath the low bar, it's kind of difficult to reach up to that high bar and move the robot out of the way to get above. So has anyone thought of any ideas on how to get past this issue?
One thing that I was thinking of was using an intake as kind of a counterbalance. So if you wanted to shift the center of gravity, you could do some kinematics to figure out how to move the intake in and out in order to keep the robot level.
Yeah, I've also thought of that actually before, and I think there's a few major issues with it, although it is a pretty interesting idea. It's that if you're going to shoot the intake out to shift that center of gravity, for example, if you uh, shoot out the intake to the right, there's center of gravity is going to shift to the right, but also the intake is going to be protruding to that right. You could also like continuously shoot the intake out and back in multiple times just to get that momentum going, kind of like a swing until you're on the side. That which is a decent idea, but the thing is, it's going to it might cause some issues if you're constantly putting that intake in and out, and it's also going to take a lot more time than if you just had one smooth motion. Yeah.
I can definitely see that. And another thing to add would be that might interfere with your alliance partner, which is also trying to achieve a hang. So I think definitely thinking of a way to hang with a mechanism that can do it in one fluid motion is essential.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I think another way that this could be done is like use your slides to hang on the like first level out of the two for hanging, and then use kind of like a pivoting arm mechanism to hang on the higher level, and then have the arm take over for the second level of hanging.
Yeah, I agree. I think that could definitely also be a possibility that could be used for the hang. I also want to mention, even though FTC hasn't had a lot of challenges with to like this high-low bar hang before, I know a lot of previous like FRC challenges have had like these types of hang before. So I think it would be like really nice if we could take inspiration off these FRC teams. In fact, we as it like quality control, we found this video of like this FRC jumping bot. So Rick, do you want to pull that up and show everyone? It's a illegal design for FTC, but it's still pretty fun and we could definitely take inspiration off like the FRC robots that have previously had like these somewhat more complicated hang challenges. So Rick, do you want to pull up that video?
I think this computer that I'm currently using has some issues with
Oh.
video. Do you have access or Can you find it like right now? And
Let's see if Ming Mei or Sophia can share the video. Can either of you guys access and share it?
Yeah, I might be able to, if you give me a second.
Okay, yeah. It's overall like a pretty like fun and cool design that is used, and it's just used an example to see how like FTC could definitely like use previous FRC designs for their hangs in order to adapt to the Into the Deep challenge. Ming Mei, have you found it?
Let me.
I think I have it. I can share it
Oh,
if you
really?
like.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's
great.
that'd be great.
All right. Sorry, I'm unmuted now. Can everyone see it?
Yeah.
Sounds good. All right. Wow. I think for this robot, it uses another banned thing in TC, which is using an air piston to generate that momentum down.
Yeah. Yeah, but I still think it was a pretty fun design to show, you know?
Totally.
Also, if anyone wants to see like a different link, it's also in the chat. I think someone sent it out. Okay, other than taking inspiration off FRC, does anyone have any thoughts as to like how we should design the hang so it can be the most efficient and most optimized?
yeah, actually, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that jumping robot. If you're going to get that robot into the air, you need to either do two things. You need to, one, build up momentum within the robot itself, like that FRC robot did, by thrusting up, I think, a large block of metal, and that gained the momentum and allowed the robot to jump into the air. The other is that you could push off of the ground, which is an issue because the tiles, they aren't exactly the most rigid of surfaces. And if you're pushing down, it's going to push into those tiles. You're also probably going to get a heck of a ton of penalties for field damage if you don't design the right type of pushing mechanisms. But in terms of jumping, we probably could do something very similar, but not entirely like jumping all the way up to high bar, which is you just jump a very short distance, like 1 or 2 inches, and get yourself off the ground. And then in that time, you quickly latch onto the high bar and you just hang directly onto high bar. Because I believe the rules in the game manual only state that you can't make contact with the high bar until the robot is completely suspended by only the low bar. But in this case, the robot isn't suspended by anything because it's in the air. So that's definitely something to consider. Does anyone else have any thoughts regarding this?
I think we can also draw inspiration from some other FTC teams. I think that Cookiebots from last year, their hang mechanism is definitely applicable to this season, and it's something that we've seen also in FRC, which might be where they have drawn the inspiration. And I know that our team's from New Hampshire, so we went to first headquarters for the kickoff. And I was talking with some of the people who design like the first games for FTC and FRC, and they said that this season FTC is drawing inspiration from FRC in a few aspects, and this FRC season will also be drawing inspiration from FTC. So I'm interested to see what that will look like.
Yeah, I think that kind of game design is probably encouraging these FTC teams and FRC teams to just gain inspiration from each other rather than limiting themselves to their own category of competition.
Totally.
I also can
have a share. It's can I share the screen? Wait, let me see.
Yeah, Adrian, go on.
Thank you. Wait. I got some settings. Oh wait, I think I can't share the screen, but I'll talk a bit about the design. So it's basically when you hang in your vertical slider, so the center of gravity, and it will make the whole robot shift towards a side, and then you can base on that side, and then you can add a slider with a hook, and it can hang. So when you hang, the whole car would like fold because the gravity is more on the our car, it's more on the left side. So when it shifts the center of gravity, and then it will fold. So we can add a slider and a hook, and then we can reach the second or third hung. Would it be
I think
okay?
I think I can explain better since I'm in the same team. So basically, there is a vertical slider on for the scoring, right? So I'll take, and then we use that vertical slider to kind of hang a bit on the low chamber, which is it chamber or rung, sorry. We hang on the low rung, and it basically, if we put the slider to like the far front, it will kind of start to flip the robot to a vertical state, if you want to call it like that. And at that state, we were planning to put another set of sliders on our panel to with a very slow torque to just hang to like reach out to the high rung and then hang it. So if you guys get what I mean. That's like one of my starting designs, but I'm not sure if it works, so I want to ask you guys for your opinions.
Yeah, let me just draw a diagram to see whether I'm getting what you're talking about. Okay, give me a second. So if this is the bar, right? Wait, actually, I probably shouldn't draw it like this. So if this is the bar, you want to have your robot and then a hook on this end of the robot.
Yeah.
Yeah, on this end of the robot. And then as you retract it, it's going to start making the robot more into a vertical position.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
What? It's not going to be completely in a vertical position. It's going to be more like this, right?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah,
And then there would be like a.
What do you do after this?
We put a slider. There's a slider basically we're gonna test it. I'm not sure where. There's a slider at that position reaching out to the high rung, and then we're gonna just lift it, and then
So like
something like that, something like that.
Something over here.
Yeah,
like
with we're not sure about the angle. We're gonna test out the angles, and yeah, there's basically gonna be a slider reaching out to that high rung.
Yeah. I think one issue with this is that, as you can see, let me use a different color. Over here, this bar. Wait, why can't I draw? This isn't working. Give me a second. Yeah. So I still can't draw. Over here, this portion of the robot is going to come into contact with this low rung, regardless of how you have a slide pulling it up. So the one thing you have to consider is you have to find a way to push the robot off to the side in this direction so that the robot can be completely clear of the low rung before you retract the slider and go up to the high rung. So do you have any considerations regarding that?
I don't really have too much considerations, but my only plan is to like put the hook really low so that actually goes to a more vertical state to hope that it like the high rung motor has enough power to pull it up past the low rung.
So like vertical position as in like this.
Can I share screen? I can draw.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Wait, sorry. I'll use paint.
Okay, yeah.
So basically this is our car, and then there's a low rung, high rung. I hope we're gonna put it really low, like at the bottom of the slider, so that if it hangs, it's gonna be like something like we hope it goes like kind of like like this. Somewhere like this, so we can put a slider around here to hang it like that. I think this should be less than the 42-inch. I'll check my measurements. No, but I want to ask about the 42 measurement. Is it the longest is it the longest possible when it's fully extended, it should be less than 42, or just in like when you're in the game you cannot extend it past 42?
I believe like you have to demonstrate that it cannot extend beyond 42. I'm not entirely sure whether longest possible is less than 42.
Yeah, since I checked the game menu, it didn't really clearly mention about it. So
I
So
think one thing that, oh, sorry.
yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
I think one thing with the 42-inch extension that we have to take into account is that it's fixed. So during inspection, you put your robot in the tape box, and from that position in the box, all the things extending can't extend beyond 42 inches, but the box isn't dynamic, it's fixed. So during a match, like let's say you defined like the box is like this, and the intake came out to here, and the rest of the robot was here, the intake can't suddenly go out this other side because the box is fixed. So, and I think and I'm not sure, like as in the case of your hang design, but is the box fixed even when the robot is pivoted off the floor plane? Because then that would mean you'd have a difficult time extending also out the front because there wouldn't be much space left.
Can you repeat that? I don't really get it.
Yeah, here, let me, here, I'm gonna find this. Maybe I'm muted. We'll see. No, I'm not muted. I'm gonna find it and I'll get back to you in a second. There's a really good YouTube video that demonstrates it well.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Actually, I had another thing to bring up for your hang. I'm gonna share my screen for a video. So this is like an FRC hang, and I don't know if this is like what your hang mechanism will kind of look like, but what they do is like they use slides to go onto the first bar, and then they kind of like extend another set of slides and like latch on to the higher bar.
Yeah, I think we're basically trying to do something like that, but there's I think two FRC games or one, I'm not sure, that uses traversal climb, but the difference is these are diagonal and ours is like we have the ones we have to do now is vertical. So I think that's a really big difference.
Oh, I see. So like you would extend kind of just vertically up and not like diagonally.
It's still in an angle since if you extend vertical, it might hit the low rung. So I think like that's one of my other considerations, but I plan to just have a prototype first before maybe just making some changes to my design.
Yeah, definitely. But like this is just something I would consider, I think, with like after you hang the like swinging of the robot.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I think one more thing kind of related to like making sure that you're like or being able to counteract that center of gravity thing is you can like do a bunch of physics and we were planning to have like a pivoting arm and we like one thing you could do is once you latch on to that first bar, you could figure out like what the exact angle is optimal such that like the slider is either externally tangent to the two bars or internally tangent to the two rungs and you could hang like that.
Yeah, I think yeah, that's always something we can do, except you're going to have to do quite a bit of tuning, even if you do those calculations beforehand, because what actually goes on with the robot and with the rungs isn't necessarily what you would calculate beforehand.
I've put the horizontal extension thing in the chat. If you'd like, I can share my screen and play it.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, let's have you share your screen.
All right, can everyone see? Sounds good. Yeah, so I felt like that just explained it quite well.
Yeah, I think I get it. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. I think now is a great time to transition into the last thing that we wanted to talk about, which was just general strategy that isn't regarding the build. So for me personally, I had a question about specific like alliance strategy when it comes to the game. Obviously, because there are two places to score, which is one above the submersible on the bars and two in the baskets in the corner. I was wondering what you guys thought would be more strategic, like either maybe having one team specialize in scoring specimen onto the bar and then the other team scoring samples onto one of the buckets? Or should both teams be doing both tasks? And if so, how would that work out without the alliances like crashing into each other or having like just good functionality in general?
So, at least I think one thing to consider is that, at least for hanging like a specimen, you only have like 20 of yours like align specific samples that are the only ones that can be hanged compared to like 40 yellow ones that you can put in a basket. So I think it is important being able to do both, like hanging a specimen and also like dropping samples in the basket. Because at one point, especially the higher levels, you're probably going to exhaust all the specimens you can hang. And so being able to utilize those yellow samples in a like useful way, especially like dropping it in the high basket would be a really good way, or at one point really the only way to earn points and edge out your competitors. So I think that's something important to consider when talking about how to score.
I think
Adding
that
on,
oh sorry.
go ahead, go ahead.
Okay. I think that this season will be quite similar to Freight Frenzy, where one robot is focusing on scoring all the cubes on the square hub, or in this case on the shared hub, or in this case specimens in the basket. And another is focusing on doing the alliance specific onto the alliance specific hub. But I do think that at the beginning of most matches, both like if at like a top level, both teams will be focusing on getting the yellow samples because those will go so fast and they will still have enough time to do all of their alliance specific specimens.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah, I think especially for this game, like robot efficiency is going to be one of the biggest things that teams have to optimize for because there's such like a limited number of samples. So like when it comes to like scoring samples, as I agree with you, Jason, like getting those yellow ones right away and then like waiting to score specimen or align specific samples after is probably going to like appear in the games, especially because like you just want to be able to have more samples in general.
I think for top teams as well, that will continue during autonomous. I think both robots will be scoring or at least moving yellow samples to their controlled sides of the field because you can spend time scoring the alliance specific and teleop. It's the advantage goes to the team that gets the most yellows. I think at a high level, this game will be maxed out easily. Everything will be scored. So whoever gets the most yellows will win. And because of the way that you're taking one away and scoring one, even just getting one over is like a 16-point difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would definitely come into consideration after teams develop the capability to score all of their alliance specific samples, and having those yellows alliance neutral samples does matter in the game.
Yeah. I think like the importance of the yellows will have like a weird trajectory throughout the season. Like really early on, like in the first like month of the game, the yellow neutral samples will be the primary method of scoring since teams are not really efficient yet, and it'll be a lot faster for teams to cycle um the samples, yellow samples compared to the alliance specific specimens. Then like around the middle of the season, I think teams will get like close to scoring everything. And then because the samples are or specimens are worth more than samples, they'll be scoring those. But then a little bit later than that, they'll end up easily being able to score 60 with two decent members of an alliance. And then it'll go back to focusing on the neutral samples because your ceiling is very significantly if you get more samples, neutral samples than your opponents.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Rick's question is actually really good. So, when do you guys think, like in the season, we're going to see teams start taking samples actually out of the basket to rebuild as specimen, especially if we're considering that like all the samples are going to be out of the submersible like pretty soon into the season?
I think one thing to answer that question, once we get to the level where we see that all the points are being scored and the focus on the neutrals being placed, as we mentioned previously, I think that's when we'll start seeing this transfer from taking the samples out of the basket to rescore them as specimens. I think that's when that's going to be pretty important.
Just to clarify, do we mean the Alliance specific samples? Because I thought that the Alliance neutral samples could not be scored as specimens.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Alliance, like the yellow samples can't be specimen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other than that, does anyone have any questions or considerations about general like Alliance strategy?
One question that I have for everyone is how do we think we will be working well with less experienced teams? I feel like a lot of teams are going to be able to score the samples in the low and high baskets, but I think that scoring specimens might be just as fast for top teams and would help the alliance more. But what are our thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there is a possibility that, say, you have a weaker team on your alliance, they could just be mainly responsible for taking like samples out of the submersible and bringing it to where the human player is, so that then the more advanced team could probably just make or like hang specimens quicker. I think that's one way we could do it. Does anyone else have any ideas for how like cooperation could work?
I think this kind of relates to another question I had, which is defense. Like if you have one team that can do like everything and one less experienced team, and they're going against like two decent teams that can score, I think that less experienced team might be like playing defense, and that'll help because I mean if the more balanced alliance on the other side, they can't afford having a defender as well. So I think in like sometimes if there's like a really strong partner and a really weak partner, there'll be a lot of defense in those scenarios.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like, I think I'll as like the setting is right now for the field, defense is typically like I don't think it's highly suggested, especially last season during center stage, because the robots had to like cross across the field in order to score points. There was a lot of robot clash going on. However, I think if like one team wants to adapt that defensive strategy that you're talking about, that would require like the weaker robot supposedly is physically going into the other alliance's side and just taking up space and making it harder for them to collect samples or score them.
Also, McCann Drive will bring a huge disadvantage when others defend because it's easy to push. So maybe Octanum Drive, or I forgot what's that called. So it's basically adding 4 wheels and 4 McCann wheels. So when you get pushed, you can push back with force. Would you guys consider that?
One other thing that I'd like to add on the defense is I think that in the case of a less experienced team playing defense, I think they might not have the knowledge to effectively execute a 5-second pin without penalty. So I think one strategy might simply be to drive around the field in like a circle or a semicircle in order to obstruct access for a limited period of time to the sides and the front without obstructing your own alliance.
I agree. I think that could definitely be a viable strategy that less experienced or like rookie teams could definitely use for defense. With that said, is there any like closing remarks or anything that we've talked about in general that any team wants to add? So this can be about intake, outtake, hang, or we can just continue the conversation on alliance strategy. So is there any like words that any team wants to add?
I just want to know who thinks the second game's gonna be like a net positive. Like when you think that like getting one more yellow sample is worth 16 points. Um is let's say 2 of those like the weight disadvantage of adding or like time of a new mechanism like worth like in terms of trade-offs, I just don't see it being 15 points enough to get a second hang.
I think
Like
think
how do
it
other people think about it?
I think it will be worth it as teams end up scoring like all the elements, because if you're able to score all the elements and just focus on that for the first 2 minutes and 15 seconds of the game, I'm leaving those being able to hang for those 30 points in those 15 seconds, I think worth it.
I would disagree with that. I would say hanging is only worth it if you can do it in under 3 seconds. You need to be able to like be like immediately finish your cycle, go back and hang within the last few seconds of a match. And you need to use that grace period like of a few seconds like during the buzzer or right after the buzzer to your advantage to get those last cycles.
I I actually think that especially regarding hang, the second hang during like the world season or states is going to be really crucial because I feel like at least by states, teams are going to have it that by like end game or like a lot of time before the actual match ends, all the samples are going to be taken out of the submersible, which means that the only option after that to maximize points is basically by hang. So I think that sure, maybe like go hanging to like the second rung during like interleague competitions may not be as crucial, but like especially during the later games such as Worlds or States, when all those samples have run out, you really need to make sure that you can have an efficient and very like reliable hang, that can hang to the second rung.
One last question that I have in terms of cycle times is what do you think for like low level like league meets and then medium level like states and then high level like worlds or MTI? What do you think the cycle times for scoring samples and specimens will be?
I think to calculate those cycle times, you could probably do a little bit of math with the time allotted and number of samples you're planning to score. However, I think that for this season, cycle time isn't really going to be that as important as maybe in other seasons, mainly because it's a pretty complex game, and just being able to cycle fast isn't necessarily going to guarantee you success in the game.
So you mean as long as you can score however many samples or specimens that will win the game, it doesn't matter necessarily the cycle time?
Yeah, I mean, after a certain point, of you and your alliance partner being able to score all of those samples or specimens, beyond that, having extra cycle time isn't really going to be that important. Yeah,
Does
for example, for example, just to add on, in terms of like early in the game, your main purpose is to try and get those alliance neutral samples and make sure your opponents don't score them, and just having a fast cycle time, be able to intake them fast so that your opponents can't use it is one way of not letting them has as many of those yellow samples. But another way would be to play good defense or maybe experiment around with like placement and strategy with that. So cycle time isn't the primary facet to getting those shared samples.
Do we think that congestion within the submersible from multiple robots intaking at the same time will be an issue, or do we feel as if it won't be? Like, I mean, as if like a bunch of elements are pushed to one side. Do you think that will be an issue?
Yeah, so I was actually talking about this with Sophia the other day, and I think we both concluded that like by like teleop time, or like just like deeper into the game, a lot of these samples are actually going to be pushed more towards the middle, or supposedly like the middle sides of the field because the teams are likely going to be coming in from the width of the submersible, which probably means that a lot of the samples are going to be pushed inwards. So for that, to resolve that, you probably just need like a longer arm that can intake those samples that are all pushed towards the center.
Yeah, another thing to do with cycle time is what exactly does cycle time mean? Does it mean that if you have like optimally placed samples, what is your cycle time? Because later into a game, the samples aren't going to be in the optimal position, and to drive over and maybe intake them, or if they're not in the right orientation, it could have like a pretty big difference, like 2 to 3 seconds of I'd say like fluctuation between your cycle times. So just saying I have X second cycle time doesn't really have that much meaning anymore.
One thing that I think we should be considering is how compactly we're able to place samples and specimens on the rungs and in the baskets. Because I know the high basket can easily fit 20 to 25 samples. if it's stacked quite nicely and neatly in there. But being precarious and like just throwing them in there will result in less capacity. So that's definitely something that teams need to consider.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I think for like the beginning of the season up until December, maybe that probably won't be a big consideration. But as we've previously talked about, especially like later into the season when all of those samples get taken up, it's really important that we're able to like score the maximum amount of samples into the basket so that we're able to maximize points because at that like really high level of gameplay, so many teams are going to have those many samples that we want to maximize the amount of like points per sample we can get.
Do you think that we'll be seeing teams when they're cycling samples, just placing them into the net zone below the baskets, as long as they can do it faster than placing in the high baskets, in order to get them into an area where the opponents can't take them and then score them after in order to get like as many as they can? Or do you think we'll just see teams just scoring them?
Yeah, I think that is certainly a strategy, but personally, I don't think that's going to be a strategy many teams are going to adopt, mainly because of how robots are structured. Usually, we would have intake on one side with like extender or something, and outtake on the other side. If the samples are then in the net zone and you have to score into the baskets, you're going to have to intake from the same side as your outtake, or rotate the robot around 180 degrees each cycle. It's going to be a lot slower and cost a lot of time. I don't really think it's worth it, like not having your opponents be able to access those samples.
Yeah.
Another way to increase the like cycles is build a machine to build a robot to actually make the specimen on your robot. If you can preload or if you can load all the clips on your robot, like you got 10 clips there, and then you can just intake the sample, make the specimen and score. You don't even need to move. That could be a huge advantage in later season.
Yeah, I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, regarding like the transfer and outtake design. Like if we could have a robot or if we could find a design for a robot that could intake, build a specimen, and just outtake, it would be super efficient and it would really maximize time. Other than that, does anyone or any other team have any questions just regarding build or strategy in general? Okay, so then this will conclude our global outreach meeting. We'd like to thank everybody for joining and contributing to the conversation. We felt it was really productive, and overall, like, thank you guys so much. We gained a lot of information, and we hope you guys all did too. Yeah, feel free to leave the meeting now. We really appreciate you guys, and we enjoy talking with you guys. Bye.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank
No
you.
problem.
Thank you.
And feel free to email
Thank you.
us
All right,
any
thank you.
questions.
All right, thank you.
Bye.